Well, in his latest letter released today, President Cyril Ramaphosa has urged schools not to reopen until all the necessary precautions are in place. So let's look at this and general communication around the reopening of schools. We're joined by political analyst Somadoda Fikeni. Prof. Fikeni, thank you for being with us. Let's start with the President's letter. He says everything is being done to protect children. What do you think of that in light of what happened today?
Well, I do think that some of us were always expecting that primary or basic education was going to be the biggest challenge, as it is the biggest portfolio in terms of moving people back to work, back to school for the learners. And therefore, mistakes were bound to be made. And there are many stakeholders there. All what we can say, government ought to learn from this. But at the same time, we should be realistic enough to say the problems that have always plagued this particular sector will not be solved because there is COVID-19 in terms of infrastructure, in terms of other things. But the bare minimum ought to be the safety of workers and the learners.
So you have some sympathy in light of the mammoth task of reopening schools. I mean, sanitation is one of the prerequisites, water. And we know that schools have been operating without those things for a very long time.
Precisely the point, because we're trying to fix the problem that has been there for decades, and the problem that ought to have been sorted out in the past. And also remember, it is not just basic education department that is affected here. You do have water and sanitation affected. You do have public works in terms of some of the structures. You do have the security of the places concerned. So this is one department that is going to test transport. It's going to test, all these other departments I've mentioned as to how they move forward. And it is a stark reminder that the work that ought to have been done some years back must now be compressed at the time when there are very little resources.
It's an incredible task. So if you have sympathy around the announcement, what about the timing of the announcement? I mean, if a train crash was coming, should the minister have foreseen that and announced much sooner?
Well, she tried to explain that her consultations were into the evening. I wish her department or herself would have found time to just give the context to say there are certain challenges that we've come across, but we'll give you greater details tomorrow. And that is the reason why schools will not open the following day. And that in itself, I think, would have eased up some pressure. But that many teachers, many parents, some of them sending kids back to boarding schools, would only learn in the morning. And that some were actually traveling to schools, it creates a bit of confusion. So one hopes that from this moment onwards, even for other departments which are still to be affected by the opening, they learn something about a coordinated approach to communication. And similarly, remember, on the issue of cigarettes, it was the same situation. And the more certain levels are opened, the more contradictions are going to come. And hopefully they'll learn to do better. But in comparative terms, though, for this unprecedented experience, you find most advanced countries fumbling in terms of communication, fumbling in terms of handling these particular problems. So when I look globally, I find that we do have serious problems, some of them historic, some of them due to the approach that has been adopted. But we have done relatively well overall.
Somadoda, what do you think of the Western Cape's decision to defy the minister's announcement, or they said they were following her gazette and going back to school today?
Well, you would expect that the partisan problems will always come up. And again, Western Cape being under the DA in many respects has been working very hard to be different from the rest, even in the interpretation of data and so forth. And it is a problem that the country will just have to work on, that when faced with a crisis of this nature, partisanship can only serve narrow interests, whether it's the ruling party ANC or it's the DA or any other party for that matter. When countries face crisis, they come together. If the problem is in the Western Cape, it is tackled there not because it's a DA problem. It is tackled there because it's fellow South Africans. So this is yet another test for our sense of patriotism and a sense of nationhood, which is not yet there.
Thank you very much, political analyst Professor Somadoda Fikeni. Stay with us after the break. We'll look at liquor. It was certainly crazy today. We'll speak to a tavern owners organisation. Was it safe?